When I talked a couple of years ago, Apache Slider was just going into the incubator then. Now Slider has been incubating for 2 years. I'm going to give a little bit of a Slider overview and then talk about what we're doing with Slider now. We're actually moving parts of it into Yarn itself, and that's becoming the Yarn native services. So the goal of Slider has been to make it easier to run long-running applications on Yarn or services, and as opposed to a MapReduce job, which is designed to run to completion. A service is something like Accumulo or HBase, where you're going to start it up and you don't want it to stop until you tell it to. There are a few key components of Slider. There's an AppMaster implementation. There's an agent that's similar to Apache Ambari's agent. That agent is going to run inside each container and start the application processes for you. It's also going to perform some config file generation and localization. There's a client element to Slider, and then there are app packages. Currently, Slider provides an Accumulo app package, HBase, Storm, Solar, Kafka, and a couple of other app packages at this point. The app packages are sort of plugins for the Slider agent, so the Slider agent knows how to configure and start that particular application. The contents of these app packages are a meta-info XML file. This contains general information about the application, like what its components are. In Accumulo's case, that will be the Accumulo master, Accumulo tablet server, monitor, GC, tracer. There are some configuration templates and some default configurations in this app package. The application tarball itself is contained in the app package. And then there are going to be some Python scripts that the agent uses to create configuration files and to start and stop the components. So when you launch a Yarn application using Slider, first the Slider client talks to the resource manager. The resource manager will start up the Slider application master in a container. That's always the first container. The app master will then request container resources from the resource manager. These will be allocated. The app master will talk to node managers to start Slider agent processes. And then the agent processes are going to sort of communicate back and forth to the app master, and the app master will send commands to these agent processes. So one command being to start up the application processes, in this case, an Accumulo master and an Accumulo T server. There are several advantages of running your app on Yarn. It's a lot easier to get it running than manually configuring and deploying your Accumulo instance. You just have to issue 2 Slider commands, a package install command that uploads the app package to HDFS, and a Slider create command that launches the application and starts all the containers. You can start and stop the app easily. You can flex the number of each component up and down, so you can change the number of T servers that are running easily. It automatically handles container and server failures, and it's easy to support multiple versions of your application. So you can run Accumulo 1.6 and 1.7 alongside each other easily, because the entire app installation is contained inside a container local directory. Something about the Slider App Master and all applications that run on Slider, including Accumulo, is that they store information about themselves in Zookeeper. Another function the Slider client performs is to be able to read information from Zookeeper and from the Slider AM to set up a client installation of Accumulo for you. It's going to be downloading config files from the AM to create this Accumulo client installation, and then the Accumulo client will be able to talk to the Accumulo processes directly. So moving on to what we're doing with Slider and Yarn now, These app packages are kind of complicated. There's a lot of stuff in them, and it's really custom to Slider. So we thought that it would be a better fit to use Docker images to package and run this information throughout the cluster. There have been a lot of Docker-related improvements in Yarn recently. There's been the Docker Container Executor for a while, but this required you to switch your Yarn cluster over to running only Docker containers, whereas in Yarn 3851, we've added the capability for runtimes for the Linux Container Executor. So this lets you specify on a per container basis whether you want to run a Docker container or a Linux container. A lot of work has been done on the Docker runtime so far in Yarn 3611. There are a lot of subtasks there, and many of them are complete. Some important ones that have already been completed are the cgroup support and network plugin support, as well as like a bunch of configurability in running the Docker run command for the container. But we still have a significant amount of work to do in the areas of user and image management. Let's see. So that previous Docker work has been committed to Hadoop trunk. With the Yarn Native Services work that's in progress, this is stuff we're working on in a feature branch. So it's not even in trunk yet. We'll be working on it in the feature branch for a while, and then eventually there would be a vote on whether that would go into trunk or not. So the Yarn Native Services has a few elements. One is a native Yarn. Well, so the umbrella ticket for this is Yarn 4692. The overall goal is to have like sort of first-class support for these long-running services in Yarn. Part of that is a native Yarn framework layer, which basically means pulling those things Slider was doing into Yarn itself and sort of integrating them more tightly with what Yarn is doing. However, one problem with that is we sort of don't want everything Slider is doing. In particular, we're not really interested in the agent elements in Yarn because you don't really want to be running Yarn code inside a container, which is what we would have to do with the Slider agent. So we're trying to move that to an agentless model, and in the process move some of the things the Slider agent was doing to other elements of Yarn. So I've committed an agentless Docker provider to Yarn, and that basically the node managers execute the Docker run commands directly when they launch the containers, as opposed to launching an agent which executes the application process. We may also end up adding an agentless Linux provider. I've thought about this some, but have not even opened a ticket for that yet. Another thing I'm going to show an example of later is the support for assemblies that we've added in Slider recently before committing this to the Yarn Native Services branch. Assemblies are complex applications of applications, and again, I'll go into that in more detail later. Two other main pieces beyond the Slider framework piece that will be added into Yarn are a simplified REST API for launching your containers. So instead of running the Slider create command, you'll just be able to post some JSON to a REST service to start up your container. Let's see, I won't be able to demo that today because it's going to be committed to this Yarn Native Services branch sometime this week, basically. And actually, one of the pieces I'm most excited about is this discovery of services via DNS. That work is going on in a separate feature branch for Yarn 4757. Basically, it's going to be a registry DNS server built on top of Yarn's Zookeeper registry. So the AM will write hostname and IP information to Zookeeper, and this registry DNS server will read that and host it as DNS entries. There will be a couple of different host names assigned to each container. One will be based on the container ID, and then the container will also have this well-known host name, as in this example here, which is based on a component name, app name, username, and domain. This is going to be really useful for end users to have like a consistent URL to connect to applications with, but I've also, in like trying out different applications on Yarn, having these host names is useful in configuring complex applications as well. So to move to this agent model, we have to relocate these slider agent features. One is the generation of configuration files. So like the Accumulo site file that's was being generated by the agent. We're now doing configuration generation in the AM. So the AM will generate config files locally, upload them to HDFS, and tell Yarn to localize those to the containers. In the Docker case, these will be mounted into the containers. The meta-info XML portion of the app package is, since meta-info is an agent concept, we'll be getting rid of that and essentially moving that information into the app config. In particular, specifications of config files to generate will be in the app config, and also URLs to export, such as the Accumulo monitor URL. And lastly, the sort of remaining portions of the app package will end up moving into application-specific Docker images. Oh, hey, I killed PowerPoint. Well, we're going right into the demo. To run Accumulo on Yarn, I'll see if we can start this up again. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so we'll need to provide a Docker image and then an app config and a resources JSON. The app config is very similar to the old slider app config JSON. It just has some more information that corresponds to what used to be in the Accumulo meta-info file. The resources JSON is actually identical to the old slider resources JSON. I have these examples in a GitHub repo called Yarn Native Services Examples. Although I caution you that to run them, you'll have to check out the Yarn Native Services branch of Hadoop, apply 2 patches that I've recently uploaded in the past week, and then build it yourself to try that out. But you're welcome to do that. Highlighting a couple sections that are new in the app config. You specify which Docker image you want to run in the app config JSON. You specify some environment variables that you want to be available inside the Docker container. You specify that you want AM config generation on and which config files you want the AM to generate. There are actually a lot more than this, but I cut it down so it would fit on the page. But the Accumulo site XML file and the Accumulo env template are important ones. All of these site properties were things that existed in the app config already. Basically, those will be the properties that go into these configuration files that are created. And in the app config, you also specify the components of your application. So in Accumulo's case, we have a master, monitor, T-server, client, etc. And for each one, you specify a Docker start command. Note also for the Accumulo or monitor component, we specify an export, which will give us the Accumulo monitor URL, and that will be published by the AM. Let's see. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this application. So in building the image, the Docker image for Accumulo, I installed Zookeeper, and I installed Hadoop and configured them, and I installed the Accumulo tarball and then left it unconfigured because those configuration files are going to be put in place by Yarn. So I realized that Hadoop, I mean, this isn't the case for all applications you would run on Yarn, but in the Accumulo case, we have a configured like Hadoop instance inside the Docker image. So we could use that to actually launch Accumulo. I wrote this launch script that just issues 2 yarn slider commands. Note they're now yarn slider commands instead of just slider commands, since slider has been integrated into these Yarn native services. I'm doing a slider resource install step that's uploading some configuration files, some templates to HDFS, and then issuing a yarn slider create command to create that application. Let's see. If we go and take a look at the AM page for this application, we can see that it's started up 1 master, 1 monitor, and 1 T-server. Didn't want to start up too many Docker containers on my VM because it's just running on my laptop here. So, and one time I started up too many and my VM got totally hosed. So we can see here these are the exports that are being published by the AM, including the monitor URL. I published it in a few different forms, including the IP. Unfortunately, I can't use Chrome to get to the monitor because it's running inside a Docker container inside my VM. But we should be able to use links to hit this in a minute. So when the Accumulo master starts up, I have a maybe init script. So it checks to see whether Accumulo is already initialized and initializes it if it doesn't. And then all the other components are just going to be waiting for that to get initialized. Let's see, do we have our, all right, it looks like we have our 3 Accumulo containers up. While we're waiting for the monitor to come up. So in my local Hadoop build, I also cherry-picked 1 commit from the Yarn 4757 branch so I could start up this registry DNS server and show you that I can do an NS lookup against the host name Accumulo monitor.ac1.root.yns.dev and show you that that returns the IP address of the monitor. Let's see, and the monitor is still not going. All right, so while we wait a minute for that to come up, that's about all for the Accumulo example. Anyhow, so once all the components have come up and the AM has published its configurations, you can also issue a couple of Docker commands to create a client image. Issuing this first one, this setup client script will start a Docker container and download Accumulo configurations from the AM. You can then commit that and then use that image to run an Accumulo shell that will connect to this particular Accumulo instance that you started. Actually, I wonder if we can. Accumulo actually has a lot of configuration files. So getting all of them takes a couple of minutes. And lastly, at the end, you can issue a script to do a yarn slider stop and yarn slider destroy of your application. Moving on to an assembly example. So the idea behind assemblies is to use entire applications as building blocks. So usually an end-to-end application isn't going to be just a Cumulo or HBase. It will have, like, say, a Cumulo, some sort of ingest, and then some sort of reader client, perhaps a UI. Let's see, at the Hadoop Summit, a coworker of mine demonstrated an assembly that consisted of Zookeeper, HBase, Kafka, Solar, Storm, and a custom UI. Configuring all of those pieces manually and connecting them together would take some time, right? But the idea behind assemblies is you have a single AM that's going to be managing all the components for all of the all of the sort of sub-applications in your complex application. And you're going to be able to configure them all together. So the example I have for using Apache Accumulo as part of an assembly is a continuous ingest application. So to do this, first we'll build an Accumulo application using a yarn slider build command. Build is kind of half of a slider create command. You build all of the information to HDFS and then you start the app. So this is just building it without starting the processes running. And then you refer to the Accumulo application as a external component. I wonder if I can go back into... So continuous ingest, if you're not familiar, is a test suite that we use when determining whether Accumulo release candidates are good enough to be an Accumulo release. So it starts some additional processes beyond Accumulo that write to and read from Accumulo. There's a really simple Docker file for this example. It extends my Accumulo Docker image, adds a couple of additional scripts, and a new app config and resources. The app config is really simple. We specify a different Docker image, a bunch of new environment variables that will be familiar to anyone who's configured continuous ingest before. And we had Accumulo as this external component type, and then have some new components, an ingester, walker, batch walker, scanner, and stats collector, which are continuous ingest components. And each one of those will have their own Docker start command. Let's see. Let me go check on this Accumulo app. Okay, so since that one never got going, I'm not going to actually try starting the continuous ingest app. But if you catch me afterwards, I bet it will work then. But launching this continuous ingest app looks very similar to launching the plain Accumulo app. You run the launch script, you can set up a client for it. And in my test run, basically I started up the continuous ingest app, let it run for a while, and then I flexed the number of ingesters down to 0. So I ran ingest into Accumulo for a while, stopped the ingest, and then inside my client container for ingest, I kicked off a MapReduce job to verify the data that had been ingested, which is sort of the typical flow we do when running a continuous ingest test. The AM for the continuous ingest app ends up looking like this. Basically, for the external Cumulo component, it goes and reads all of the Cumulo configurations and populates those Cumulo components at the bottom, and then adds the extra continuous ingest components we have. And that's all. Sorry, the demo didn't work seamlessly, although I guess that's to be expected. Again, this is sort of really a work in progress, the Yarn native services work, but I've been having a lot of fun work on it, and I think it's very promising for making Cumulo and complex applications easier to run on Yarn. Any questions? Let's see. I think so. Eric said that integration is really hard, and are there any like frustrating or interesting aspects? I think what he really means is I've been working on this a year and it's not done yet. So what's the deal? Yeah. Let's see. So it's interesting. One of the things that's going on is that I think Docker is maturing and changing really rapidly. So when we first started trying this out, we had to have like a custom network type to get IPs assigned to our containers and be able to use the DNS, like our special DNS server. And now in a later version of Docker, there are network plugins, and we don't have to do that anymore. We can just use the default, well, let's say we can use bridge networking and get our IPs assigned that way. Another thing that we're still working out is users. So we're kind of running everything as the nobody user inside the container right now. So there's a problem like, what user are you going to run the process as inside the container? And like the users outside probably don't match the users inside, and even if they're the same names, they might have different UIDs, or maybe they have different names in the same UID, and the users and permissions thing is really tricky, and we don't have a good solution for that yet. Let's see. Any other interesting aspects? I guess I'll give it some more thought and get back to you. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, users are hard. Networking is hard. Let's see, another odd thing we've had to deal with is that, so the idea is you would have like a normal DNS server, and it's going to delegate lookups for this specific domain that you configure in the Yarn configuration file to the registry DNS server. Let's see, so in the DNS server we tried, it was somehow configured to cache negative lookups for 3 hours or something like that. So like if you did a lookup too early before the container was ready, then you wouldn't be able to find that host name again for 3 hours. So the first thing we did was like lower that threshold, but there's still an issue there. You don't want like a user to try to hit a URL and then not be able to get to it for a significant amount of time because the negative hit has been cached. Except for that tricky issue, the DNS lookups are really awesome. It's amazing to be able to do that. Yeah. And let's see. Another thing I sort of glossed over, that the slider agent does port allocation, but you don't have to do that at all in the Docker world because you can always use the default ports inside the Docker container. Any other questions? Thanks.